Hello, listeners. This is Kat. Welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfic. This will be the continuation of All For You. This will be part 2, Day 7. Day 7, 27 weeks. It had been 1 week since Izuku was born, and Hisashi could say with certainty it had been one of the worst weeks of his entire life. All of his time had been dedicated to watching Izuku's condition like a paranoid hawk and pestering the staff with questions about even the slightest change. He was not familiar with Izuku's drugs. The only drugs he was familiar with were illicit ones. He had a hand in selling. He had no idea what a diuretic did. And his memories of dealing with Yoichi's condition were fuzzy with age, so he was as in the dark as any other parent in this horrid hospital ward. At least the staff understood that no one ever really wanted their child to be in the NICU. Any time Izuku's condition was stable enough that he wasn't worrying, he was sorting through his healing quirks for the upteenth time. He had a few, but painfully, none of them were applicable. All his healing quirks had to do with healing injuries, but Izuku had no injuries. His body simply wasn't working the way it was supposed to. Even if his healing quirks were applicable, Hisashi had no idea what he was doing. In trying to help Izuku, he may inadvertently sentence him to death. If he ever wanted to try using one of them, he would have to consult the doctors, and doing that would require giving away his true identity. It was still something he had seriously considered. Nevertheless, Hisashi decided, at least for now, that he wouldn't attempt to use any of his quirks, at least until he had a clear head, something he lacked at the moment. It's been 1 week since Izuku was born, and through that whole time he had only slept 3 hours. Hisashi's stamina quirks could only last so long. His head was full of cotton, and he had begun to tremor slightly, though if that was due to stress or sleep deprivation, or both, was a bit of a toss-up. He had been nodding off more and more frequently, to the point where he had almost fallen asleep standing up. Not eating hadn't exactly helped either. He had been so reluctant to leave Izuku's side that he had not even seen the cafeteria. The only times he had stepped away were to use the bathroom and quickly shove a protein bar in his mouth. In his defense, he didn't really have much of an appetite to eat anything more substantial. At the very least, he hadn't been wearing the same clothes for the past week. One of the nurses had taken pity on him and provided him with some medical scrubs to wear instead of the suit he had been wearing for days. He should have felt enraged at the pity, but at the moment, and even now, he just felt grateful. Hisashi felt a little exposed in something other than his usual button-down suit and slacks, but the scrubs were extremely comfortable, so he didn't really mind. Masaru had also called recently and said he and Mitsuki were going to bring him some more clothes, as well as basic toiletries and personal items, since they must have realized Hisashi had no intention of leaving the hospital, or even the room, until Izuku did, whether that was in a casket or a bassinet. They hadn't arrived yet. Mitsuki was due any day now, so their movements were slow, but he still appreciated the thought. Hisashi's head pounded in time with his heartbeat. He knew he was pushing it. He knew he couldn't last like this. But he also couldn't find it within himself to actually try to get any rest. Any time he tried, he was assaulted by the reminder that the last time he slept, when he woke up, Izuku was diagnosed with a dangerous heart condition. If Hisashi tried to sleep again, who's to say Izuku would even be alive by the time he woke? He couldn't rest. He couldn't miss anything. Izuku's condition was perilous. His tiny son was already hooked up to multiple IV drugs to manage his heart condition, especially since he had started to teeter on the edge of a heart failure. He didn't move much. All his energy seemed to be spent on simply staying alive, despite all the machines helping him. And yet, it was still too soon for the corrective surgery that would save Izuku's life. He was too small. Hisashi sighed quietly, staring into the incubator. Despite his reservations, Sanaki-san, Izuku's doctor during the day, had said that gentle touch was something that would help calm Izuku down, even with his fragile skin and underdeveloped nervous system. He had to be careful, though. He had to make sure his hands were clean. He could not stroke or rub Izuku's skin because he might hurt Izuku, and he had to make sure that touch was the only stimulation Izuku was receiving. Speaking while holding his hand would be overwhelming for him. Hisashi washed his hands 3 times and then sterilized them with fire. Izuku would not be getting an infection from him. And now, for the first time, he had been able to touch his son. Well, technically, he could have touched him earlier. He simply hadn't had the bravery to do so. Now he did. Izuku was holding his fingertip. His hand was too small to hold anything more than that, or to even fully wrap around it. His grip was feather-light. Hisashi could barely feel it, still holding Izuku's tiny hand. Looking at fingernails the size of the head of a pin, Hisashi smiled softly to himself. He had always heard the phrase, wrapped around their little finger, and thought of manipulating others to do his bidding. He had never understood why that phrase was often applied to little children. He supposed he could see it now. Only a week old, and his little Izuku was already a master manipulator. He was so proud of him it hurt. He moved his finger up and down gently, watching Izuku shift slowly in response. Izuku gripped a little harder for a moment before it came feather light again. This was the best he had looked since his diagnosis, and he seemed to be pretty relaxed as well. His heart rate was as normal as it could be. He was a little pale, but he hasn't gone blue again in a while, and his movements were slow and relaxed. Hizashi smiled. He resisted the urge to coo. The door to Izuku's room opened. "Midoriya-san," Anda said. Anda was one of Izuku's nurses during the day, at least for 3 or 4 days of the week she worked. During the time he'd been stuck here, he learned that most of the staff in the NICU worked 12-hour shifts for at least 3 or 4 days a week, although he tended to see Sanaki-san and Reiki-san, the neonatologists, every day during their respective shifts. Other providers, like respiratory therapists or very occasionally pharmacists, especially if he had questions about Izuku's medications, which he frequently did, stopped by, though he had yet to learn their names. Anda was a kind woman, with yellow hair, golden eyes, and a rather stout stature. She seemed quite strong, but he had never pressed for her quirk. He had more important things to pay attention to. Hizashi looked over at her, out of the corner of his eyes. He smiled at her, though, something clenched in his gut. Anda was normally pretty cheerful, and she sounded reserved right now. "Oh?" he asked. "Are the Bakugos here?" "No. Megumi Ito, one of the social workers, would like to come speak with you if you have a moment," Anda said with a quick smile. Social work? They had come to talk with him earlier in the week about his home life, to make sure that if Izuku came home, he would be in a safe, stable environment, and he had assured them Izuku would have nothing but the best of care if he came home. They had also come to ask about his well-being, but he had assured them he was fine. They didn't push, but it was also clear they hadn't believed him. No matter. He would be fine, so long as Izuku was. But what did they need to talk about now? "All right. Thank you," Hizashi said, and Anda nodded before closing the door. Hizashi sighed sadly, looking over at Izuku again. His baby was still holding his finger, but his mouth opened in a yawn as his leg twitched, a sure sign Izuku was done with touch for a while. Hizashi pulled his finger away gently, the tip of his finger cold as Izuku's tiny hand left it. Izuku spread his fingers jerkily, yawning again before slowly settling. Izuku's fingers curled as his chest rose and fell. He wished Izuku's tolerance was a little higher, but it was what it was. Hizashi ran a hand through his hair, knowing well that it was a futile effort to make himself look any more presentable to the social worker. His suit was lying crumpled and dirty in the corner. He was wearing scrubs that didn't belong to him, and he was sure the bags under his eyes were something to behold. At the very least, he could make sure his hair wasn't a rat's nest. Too soon the door creaked open, and a woman poked her head through, her quirk giving her the appearance of an anthropomorphic cockatoo. She smiled. "Hello, Midoriya-san. Is now a good time?" Hizashi forced a smile. "Yes, of course." "Thank you," she said, slipping in and closing the door behind her. "My name is Megumi Ito, and I'm the social worker assigned to your son, Izuku. There is a conversation I'd like to have with you, but it might be upsetting." Hizashi frowned. His stomach clenched. Something was wrong. Ito continued. "It might be best to not have this conversation next to Izuku. Would you be willing to come to my office or a nearby room?" "I would rather not," Hizashi said, his hands clenching against the arm of his chair. Ito nodded. "I understand completely, but this is about your profession." Profession? His documents stated he was a simple salaryman. Hizashi's stomach dropped. Oh no. The forged documents for his medical history had never been finished. Izuku came too early. He'd been found. He let out a slow breath, his eyes darting to Izuku. He had not moved since he had settled down. His chest rose and fell quickly, his heart monitor beeping again. "I think we should have this conversation somewhere else. I don't think either of us want to risk upsetting Izuku," Ito said gently. Hizashi stood up, brushing off his clothes. He looked back at Izuku. This would likely be the longest he'd been away from his side since he was born. Hizashi did his best to sear Izuku's image into his mind. He looked back at Ito. "Very well. Lead the way," All for One said. Ito nodded, pulling the door open and walking out. All for One felt a pull in his chest, from his heart. He didn't want to leave, but he had to do this. Ito led them to an empty patient room nearby, closing the door behind her. She turned around, set her shoulders, clasped her hands, and began to speak. Like I said before, I'm the social worker assigned to your son. This means that I'm here to advocate for you and your son to get you the best outcome possible. I will tell you the situation straight. Ito met his eyes. The heroes are aware of who you are, where you are, and they are not happy. All for One's lips thinned. All this time, all this work, and he got caught because of paperwork. It would be infuriating, if he had the energy to feel that way. As long as you are on our property, they cannot arrest you unless you are an active threat to the patients and staff of the hospital. However, because of your classification, we are not sure how long that's going to last, Ito stated. You know who I am, then, All for One said. It wasn't a question. Ito nodded. Yes, I do, All for One. All for One's eyes narrowed. Then you know what I have done. You know what the heroes consider me. Why are you posing as an ally? Because, at least for now, I am, Ito said firmly. Tanima Memorial was named after Minako Tanima, the daughter of the villain Akanthia. She died of leukemia after the healthcare team that should have saved her life decided she wasn't worth it. This hospital, Ito said, pointing at the floor underneath their feet, is here to make sure that never happens again. So again, my job is to make sure that patients and their families, all patients and all families, have the resources they need. Who you are and what you've done outside these walls is not my priority, unless that poses a threat to Izuku's safety. Ito folded her arms, meeting his eyes unflinchingly. Does it? All for One blinked. It took a moment for the weight of her question to sink in, but when it did, it threatened to pull him under. Megumi Ito was asking him to choose. His empire, that he had worked for over a century to build, or Izuku. His brother's quirk, the last thing he could possibly have of him, or Izuku. His immortality, his goals, his dreams, or Izuku. It was a cruel question. He wanted to say it was a ridiculous question, but he thought of the dog days of summer, all those years ago, playing with Yoichi, carefree, happy, and innocent. He thought of the worst day of his life, losing Yoichi. He thought of the other worst day in his life, losing Inko. He thought of little Izuku, looking back at him, baby blue eyes unfocused, but undoubtedly looking at him. No, Hizashi said. It does not. A grin flashed on Ito's avian face. To his mild irritation, she didn't look surprised. Okay, then, Ito said, clapping her hands. Hizashi barely resisted flinching. He was far more out of it than he had thought. Down to business, she said, pulling a sheet of folded paper out of her pocket and handing it to him. We have a long-standing contract with the HPSC and have worked with other public health and mental health organizations to offer a villain rehabilitation program. Enrolling in that would be your best bet. Hizashi took the paper slowly and unfolded it. The words swam in his vision. He turned on a sight quirk and forced his eyes to read. Is this program really set up for someone like me? Hizashi asked warily, reading it again. Technically speaking, the highest tier villain we've had before is a C tier, Ito admitted. The tier system is rather arbitrary, but I think that we both know there is a difference between C tier and S tier. However, Ito pointed out, a grin flashing, there is no exclusion based on ranking for admittance to the program in the books. We will simply be treading new ground. Hizashi folded the paper back up, sliding it into one of his many pockets of his borrowed scrubs. Quite. If you are willing, Ito said, we can begin this process today. I cannot promise any outcomes, but it will offer far more protections than simply being on hospital grounds. If you are not willing— I am, Hizashi said, cutting her off. What do I need to do? There's paperwork, Ito said dryly. Hizashi huffed. Of course. And you will need a hero to sponsor you, Ito finished. Hizashi froze. Can it be an employee of the HPSC? He asked. Surely he must have some members of that corrupt hellhole in his back pocket. No, Ito said. It has to be a hero in good standing, and with your ranking, the higher ranked, the better. Hizashi closed his eyes, a hand rising to rub at his increasingly pounding temples. Fuck, he muttered. Still willing to give this a go? Ito asked professionally. Hisashi sighed. You said it was my best option to keep Izuku by my side, correct? Ito tilted her head to the side and looked away. I may have been lying slightly when I said that. What? Ito shrugged, a sharp smile on her face. I'm pretty sure it's your only option. Against his will, Hisashi chuffed a laugh. I was going to say yes anyway. The Tanima representative slid a villain rehabilitation sponsor form at All Might. All Might looked down at it, stared at the picture of All for One, looked back up. The representative smiled, looked back down, looked back up, looked back down, looked back up. What is this? A villain rehabilitation form, the representative started. I know that, All Might snarled. He snatched the paper with one hand and balled it up with a vengeance as he stood. No, I am not signing this form for that monster. All Might, Night Eye said. You should at least read it. All Might stared at Night Eye incredulously. Anger festered in his gut. No, I will not. All Might turned to glare at the representative. Is this some kind of cruel joke? No, sir, the representative said easily. All Might, the worst that will happen is you gather intel, Night Eye pointed out. What makes you think anything on here is true, Night Eye? All Might snapped, whipping back around to his sidekick, his fist clenched. Night Eye sighed. We don't know why All for One was found at Tanima, and now a representative from there has just come and handed us information. There is likely to be some truth we can filter from it. Night Eye pointed out. All Might growled. He hated the fact that Night Eye was right. Even a crumb of true information will be more than we have been able to find out in 5 years, Night Eye finished tiredly. He has a point, Toshinori, Gran said. All Might sighed. He picked up the chair that had fallen to the ground when he stood and sat back down. He looked down at the empty table. His lips thinned. The Tanima representative slid another villain rehabilitation sponsor form at All Might. You came prepared, didn't you? Gran grumbled. Yes, sir, the representative said cheerfully. All Might sighed heavily and grabbed the paper, forcing his eyes to look at it. He glared at All for One's picture. The picture smiled back. All for One's red eyes narrowed into heartless slits. The words above the picture read Villain Rehabilitation Sponsor Form. All Might ran a hand down his face, cutting off his vision. He picked up the paper and waved it over his shoulder. I can't do this. You read it, he said. Night Eye sighed, exasperated, but the paper disappeared from between All Might's fingertips regardless. Silence fell as Night Eye read. All Might's hand fell from his face. He stared at the table with a scowl, his fingers tapping. What was the purpose of this? What was he planning? All for One always had one. Well, Night Eye said, shocked. I suppose that explains why he went to the NICU. All Might froze. What? Give me that, Gran snapped. There was a sound of Gran's quirk and the rustle of papers. Gran swore vehemently. What's wrong with you people? Gran snarled at the representative. Why would you keep the spawn of that monster alive? Tanima serves all who walk through our doors with the same care and respect, sir, the representative said professionally. What? All Might repeated. Read this, Toshinori, Gran said, slapping the abused piece of paper on the table. All Might pulled it toward him, like the paper was going to bite him. He skimmed it, actually read it again. No, absolutely not. This is a lie. This is part of one of his schemes, All Might said, turning to glare at the representative. He smiled at him. Isn't it? Don't kill the messenger, the representative said simply, as if he'd done this 1,000 times. All Might forced himself to take a deep breath. The representative was right. The person he was enraged with was All for One, not a man just doing his job. While I don't doubt that this is a trick, Night Eye said, taking his glasses off and cleaning them, something doesn't make sense. There's no clear end goal here. He has to have one. He always does, Graham pointed out. He's probably hiding behind the child while he does something else. All Might slammed a fist down on the table. The furniture creaked. A child! How low can he go? All Might hissed, glaring at the table. How could he not see this coming? There had to be a way he could have prevented this. Tell us more about this supposed child, Night Eye said. I'm sorry, but I cannot tell you any more than what is on that form, the representative said, his voice unrelentingly professional. Is the bastard still there? Gran asked. Visiting hours are open, yes, the representative replied. All Might snarled, shooting up to his feet again. Then I'm getting him. I'm sorry, the representative interrupted. But you cannot make arrests on Tanima Memorial Hospital grounds unless the individual in question is an active threat. He is, Graham protested. All Might gaped at the representative. His professional smile never left his face, his hands clasped neatly in front of him. This is a matter of national security. All Might burst out. And that matter can be handled once he is off of our property. He is not an active threat, the representative said, glancing at Gran Torino, who continued to glare at him. How is your facility still open? You lot are a bunch of villain sympathizers, Gran accused, pointing his cane at the representative. As I said before, Tanima serves all who walk through our doors with the same care and respect, sir, the representative said professionally. He then turned to All Might and said, We have a long-standing agreement with the HPSC regarding our independence as a facility. If you, as a hero and representative of the HPSC, violate our terms, that will change. I don't think that is something either of us want. All Might snarled in frustration. So we are just supposed to take your word and his word and just sign this document, Night Eye said incredulously, pointing to the incriminated piece of paper. If you want, you can come and speak with him. Visiting hours are open. Just make sure that you are up to date on your vaccinations and that you are not a disturbance. Otherwise you will be asked to leave, the representative said. Silence fell. All Might seethed. We need to know more, All Might, Night Eye said with a long-suffering sigh. I know talking with him is not ideal, but we need to know more. Don't act rashly, Toshinori, Gran warned. I'm going, All Might said, turning to leave. All right, listeners, this concludes Day 7 of All For You, and also Chapter 13. I hope you all are enjoying this so far. Let me know your thoughts and reactions. Day 8 will be next, and as always, thank you so much for listening.